Hello, film fans. Welcome to Berlinale Meets. My name is Mark Peranson. I'm the head of programming for the Berlinale. And today we're here to discuss A Little Love Package with the filmmaker Gastón Solnicki, who is joining us from Buenos Aires. Gastón, welcome. Good to see you.
Hello, Mark. Very nice to see you.
As always. So, Gastón, you made a film about, which is probably the most important issue, which is very important to Berliners especially, which is a woman trying to find an apartment. But the film is a little more than that, which we can get into. But before we talk in specifics, this is your fifth film, I think, and I remember that when we first talked about the film, you told me that for you this is your first film. What do you mean by that?
Well, it was something Godard said about one of his films, and somehow I feel that in this film I am finally, after, like you said, the 4 previous films, following on my early interest in whatever it is we call fiction and working in a different kind of scale that I had been working in my previous films, which was much more intimate and more documentary, so to speak, at least from a production point of view. So somehow after rejecting this approach to financing and constructing my films, basically on this long fermentation process that many colleagues are very used to and manage to handle quite well, I have this feeling that somehow, taking on my very bad experience in school, I had this reaction against doing these things a certain way. And finally in this film, I begin to return to some of this tradition of moving the camera a certain way, or using lighting, or having more people around me, which, in that sense feels more like the way I engaged. I thought about making films when I was studying a long time ago.
This is also the second film you've made in Vienna. After your last film. You're from Buenos Aires. What brought you to that city, and what interests you in the city, and why did you want to make this film there?
Well, I was in Vienna the first time when I was 4 years old in 1982. It was quite, I have a lot of memories about this trip. We were also driving around the Iron Curtain, and there's a lot of anecdotes from that time. I always felt, in my personal cosmology, like Hegel said, the protagonist of my first film, the East had always had a very important, even instinctive, at first, importance in my life. I was in Vienna back as a teenager, and then finally, you were there when I was with my first film, Sudan. You introduced me to my friend Hans, and then began a very special friendship, which often people find difficulties understanding in its full capacity. So I've been coming to Vienna very often. I was very privileged to come to Vienna and to spend time with Hans and with other friends. And I grew very fond of the city. Of course, it's a very different world from Buenos Aires, more so. But there are strong connections, not only to my fantasies of the previous life of the long nomadic tradition of our families, but also to certain cosmopolitan aspects that relates to the Buenos Aires I got to discover as a child in the 80s or as a teenager. And more so, it grew as a very interesting location. Of course, the way time is crystallized in many ways, as opposed to Buenos Aires, where it has been very, like many other cities, destroyed over and over. But also somehow it became, from a production point of view, an increasingly interesting place. Always for me, the idea of travel, of this kind of displacement, whether in the narrative or on the side of the production, has been important for me. So coming to Vienna now for the second time, of course, this film is very related to Introduzione in some ways or the other, but also from a production point of view. Incredibly enough, I found in Austria much more support than I ever found here in Argentina. For instance, I was in Vienna 2019 presenting a 2-minute short, and I literally received more support from Argentine Film Institute for those 4 shots than for all of my previous filmography. So I was in Vienna. I learned about these last days of smoking, and this, became an interesting approach to a new project that I hadn't foreseen at the time. So Vienna, at the point, let's just say, it is a very interesting place for me to make films. Also with my friend Paolo Calamita, the producer, who's incredibly supportive of this very risky approach to production, in which we really don't have many or any of the usual materials people deal with to raise money or spend it. And we can do this because for Austrian and even for Argentine standards, my films are very small, because it's really a small group of people, and we work a certain way that it's not the typical way structures are, organized in cinema.
Just to stick with Vienna for a minute, there's a sort of a few focal points of the film. One of them is an old cafe. As you mentioned, the film begins with the smoking ban in Vienna a few years back. And a lot of the film is shot in one particular cafe, which is the Cafe Weidinger. Why did you want to shoot there, and how did you get to know the Weidinger family?
Well, I was first introduced to Weidinger through my friend Paolo and my friend Jem Cohen, who also filmed there, his film, Museum Hours. And of course, this is not the obvious First District, Gothic and 18th century Vienna. So this also brings it closer to the 20th century that I was especially interested in portraying in this film. The access we had to certain places, namely Weidinger Cafe, but also the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and I'm talking about institutions or buildings, but also with people and family. We were a really tight, very warm Latin, Austro-Portuguese, Argentine cell of people moving around. A very dense Vienna. This was filmed, November 2020. It was really the what we thought at the time was the core. Let's hope now it's something of the past, but a really closed city. There was dynamic lockdowns. Things were changing as we were filming. Only on the second day that we filmed, there was this terrorist attack, the first one since the 80s in Vienna. It happened actually very close to where we were filming. So there was really this atmosphere of horror, which somehow has been more metaphoric, I would say, in my recent films, from the part of opera composed right before the beginning of the First World War, to this little short that I was presenting in Vienna that began with the fire of Notre Dame, a few days before the fire of Notre Dame. So this idea of decay or imminent collapse has been present somehow in a mysterious way in these recent films, but in the shooting it was actually very literal and present. We were filming in the streets. There was the military was in the streets looking for the terrorists. Being in the street was not allowed. So, it was quite strange how we managed to on the first place, get to Austria, because so many people coming from different countries. We had no guarantee that this would happen. But once we were there, how these structures would open. I can already state that my film would have not been possible without this terrible context.
Yeah, you really feel when you see the film, it's not the normal way that people see Vienna, because I think of the pandemic. It feels like at certain times like an empty city. It's also the way you shoot the film. It's not necessarily a factor of the pandemic, but in a way you really feel that it comes through. I wanted to ask about the cast of the film, because you basically have two actors who are, say, the leads, Angeliki and Carmen Chaplin. Can you talk about both of them? And also this leads me to the second part, which is the film is not just only in Vienna, but also there's a section shot in Andalusia with Carmen and her family. And I'm wondering how the hell you convinced them to do that.
Well, it relates to your previous question. I think there was certain things that I'm trying to do, which are not very clear even to myself. And they have to do with the way we organize ourselves. There really is no script. It really is all improvised. These great actors and friends, Carmen and Angeliki, are really improvising, and all this wonderful dialogue, which I understand for a while it's the lowest ceiling of this approach to improvising. It's really quite incredible how they came up with so much of this under the circumstances in which we were filming, which were very difficult for them as well. There was really no place to warm up or to charge batteries or so on. So the aspect of access to institutions, to people, even to fellow friends and actors, I believe it's somehow a mysterious function of the way we approach going together on a trip, living together, and enjoying ourselves, and really, a big part of sounds like ironic, but an important part of our budget goes to food. I mean, people are really nicely treated. I'm not trying to torture anyone or myself, and there is enough demand on the process, the physical and spiritual process of going through making this film. And I understand I don't have a script. This gives me a lot of freedom. It's also a big challenge. Somehow, I mean, I'm used to that because I began making films literally by myself. But then starting to get surrounded by people who, follow you and somehow believe that something will come out of this, it is a very big pressure, that it's an increasing challenge for me, especially as I begin to surround myself with more experience and, people like I have in this film. In that regard, Rui Posas, of course, it's a complete luxury of a friend, because also he's so instinctive as to what things work and what things don't. So really, we filmed little, but most of what we film is in the film, which is quite strange for this documentary unscripted approach. There's this intuition that he has, and I'm not stubborn about things. I have a lot of things I'm interested in filming, but I can let them go quite easily, because I always know that it's more interesting what we find, like the characters inviting her, like this janitor in the building where we were staying. I immediately realized this guy is much more interesting than anything I probably came with. So we start to include these things. And as for Carmen family in Andalusia, after we filmed in Vienna in November, a few months later, I had edited the film, and I felt that I still wanted the film to grow in a certain way, but I felt there was room for this. And I know Carmen for many years now. We were friends since I was studying in New York, back like early 2000s. And I was always very fond of her father, who I had seen in his early film his film with his father, A King in New York, which is my favorite child performance ever. And I always was very fascinated by him and the things Carmen told me. And he led this very intimate life, kind of hiding away and sort of recovering from the presence, both life and death of his father. And somehow it became possible that I came to Andalusia, first only to meet him and see whether I could make something. But the minute I landed in Madrid, I felt this was the moment to go for it. And we started organizing, putting together a little crew to film for a week with them. And I didn't know anybody in the family of Carmen, but they were all really open and nice, and somehow became it was difficult, the logistics, of course, because there was filming with kids and goats, and also different landscapes that were not so easy to move around. But it was something very intimate and special to be with them, and they opened like other people opened in Vienna. I cooked for them. I think, to answer your question, I arrived to their house and I was cooking for them for a few days, and something that, they gave me probably a chance, and it was, I did not need to spend much. I only needed to torture them for a week. So I cooked a little bit for them, I filmed them, and then I was gone, and that's what you see in the film.
We're almost out of time, I think, but I have a few more questions. One, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about the music in the film. As I think people who maybe are familiar with your work know, you're a big fan of classical music. Your first film was about a composer, Mauricio Kagel. So there's a lot of classical music in the film, so if you can address that as he walks away. But there's also a pop song, which I'm not going to say what it is. It's going to be a big surprise to anybody who sees the film. So we won't talk about that, but talk about the classical music and why you chose those pieces.
Sorry, my cat was...
Oh, your cat's back. Okay, good.
Yeah, he was asking to come back in. He recognized your voice. Yes, the music has been always very present and very important in my approach to making these films. I do not have a lot of strict preconceived elements that I want to work with, but music becomes somehow clear to me as I go, and this is important for me. It's not like I say, I want to make a film with this piece or that piece, but somehow it starts. So I think it's because, and I should start putting it in my resume, but before there was cooking and anything else, I was a DJ in my teenage years. And I really believe, I really was a DJ. I was assisting this DJ, and I was, as a teenager, I was playing in these big nightclubs, and I think just being exposed to this position where people are expecting you to at least not interrupt the music, which of course I did with my Tourette at the time. There's something about this immediateness of relating to a dynamic range. There's a piece by Grisey, the Spectrum master, French master, from the 80s called Les Espaces Acoustiques, which many of my friends esteem as the Beethoven's ninth symphony of our 20th century. I use a lot of it, this opening viola solo, the prologue, and this, it's called partials, this large orchestral piece, which is only a fragment. And then, like you said, there's pop music, there's Couperin, there is Cage. There's a lot of correspondences. People may find unsettling that it seems like classical and popular and this and that, but just like fiction and documentary, I don't waste too much time in these categories. A lot of this music is written, regardless of the genre, it is written in the 80s, or it's recorded in the 80s, or it's written, Cage and Couperin, they are both in E minor. So there is a lot of correspondences, and it is there, These correspondences exist, just like with the characters. They are challenging, they are luring. I work around them with my friend Alan in the editorial process, but I work around these nuances, these layers. I found it very difficult throughout my life to learn how to write so that my handwriting would be understandable or to speak in a way. And it's just really when I started making films that the things started to make sense, and I could, for the first time, felt understood to a certain extent. So these are really the layers that my synapses manages to print down again, perhaps for the first time. And like my psychoanalyst, to whom the film is somehow dedicated, who passed away last year, said, every one of these films I finish is a hit in my life, in that it really affects. And even if I continue to try to write a certain way and to put a script so that we don't need to torture ourselves so much in the process for lack of proper funding, I still find that there's a personal way of gathering people and navigating these shootings, which makes sense at the end. And I'm still trying to understand what I'm doing.
Okay, last question. The title.
Oh, the title, yeah. The title, it's in a way the strangest and the simplest title. My titles tend to be a little ununderstandable, unpronounceable, always in different languages. This is the first title that is not named after a musical piece. I do think there's a certain shift in this film in relation to the others. It comes from these postcards that my friend Hans from Vienna, who's at the center of my previous film, used to send me. Little package to remind you that we're still alive. He would send from Vienna books and pictures and so on. It was an early idea. I didn't find a better one. I like how it somehow casts over many of these layers. Some people don't like it.
I think the title's fine. That's all I can say. No, it's a great title. It's a great film. Thanks, Gaston, and thank you all for watching. What was that?
It's impossible to translate to Spanish without it being very silly, so I'll have to deal with that later.
So the title is only going to be in English, universally, basically.
Yes.
You can do a Hungarian, maybe. Okay,
Well,
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you.